Welcome back, Exponential 201. We are in lesson 3 of this module, and we're talking about change management and how do we help other people embrace the change that we've been dreaming and planning and preparing for. So this lesson, last lesson in this module about change management, I encourage you to go back to listen to and watch some of these again and again. But the language of leadership and change comes from a book I'll mention just in a second, some of the thoughts from The Secret Language of Leadership. And it's so interesting that it's our language, it's how we talk as leaders that can either help people, inspire them to rise up to change, or inhibit their desire for change. And so I would encourage you to think about this. First of all, begin a meeting, particularly where you're trying to get them to be positively predisposed to change, right? Is engage their imagination and paint a picture of what the future could look like. And so, for example, you may have actually heard me using some of this in some of the ads for this program or in videos and that kind of thing. Imagine a church that is so full of young people that you have to start another service just to handle them all. Wouldn't that be a good problem to have? You're asking them just to imagine it. Stephen Denning is the author. Secret Language of Leadership. It's a great book if you ever want to read it. I've been through it several times. And so, language of change and the language of leadership. And you're engaging their imagination, so you're not telling them something, you're taking them somewhere, right? Really important how you do this. Don't say, we want to have this many people. No. Imagine. They're all meeting before service in small groups, sharing with the Lord what He's taught them all week, and praying for one another, encouraging one another. Can you imagine that? And you keep going because you're trying to build in their imagination. They're so hungry for more of God. They stay after the service every week for another class just to grow even more. Can you imagine that? Imagine that so many want to come to church each week. There are literally 2,000 lined up waiting for the service to end so they can be the first ones in for the next service. Can you imagine that? And so you keep going, building on this sense, and maybe you do it all at one time, maybe you do it week after week. Can you see in your mind's eye 14 and 15-year-olds leading small groups of those who just a year or two younger than them just learned to give their life to Christ, and they're helping them thrive in their faith? Can you imagine so many unsaved parents in the community coming out of curiosity to your church because they are so grateful that you're helping them deal with all the crazy aspects of life their 13-year-olds are having to face? So, engaging people's imagination is huge when you're trying to get them to tell a different story. And it's really called narrative intelligence. We'll talk about that because storytelling is a huge part of a language of leadership. Instead of just telling them data and stuff, when you tell stories, proper stories at the right time, you convince people at an emotional level, not just a cerebral level. Could you contemplate, here's another way of thinking about it as you're sharing the vision. Could you contemplate the biggest problem that you have is enough time to have enough services and seats for all of these young people who want to get in worship over the weekend? What a good problem to have, right? He talks about several mistakes leaders use when they're communicating a vision. Let's talk about it. They're unclear, uninspiring goal. They say, we're going to do this, blah, 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 and they're not inspiring and it's not clear. Number 2 is a lack of total commitment for change. And so not appropriating people or time or energy to get something done. Mistake number 3 is incongruent body language. So as you're up in front of whatever group, the whole church or a small group, and this is going to be the most exciting thing. I'm telling you, these exponential churches are popping up all over the world, and we get to be one of them. We're some of the early adopters. We're going to apply these things. Not only we're going to be part of changing the data for the next 30 years for global Christianity, but we're going to change it for our own state, for our own country, for our own city, for our own town. And your face should reflect that. Mistake number 4 is misreading the audience. Now, in order to have narrative intelligence, that is, to intelligently tell a story that communicates with your audience, you got to understand the audience's story. Are they discouraged? Are they old? Are they young? Are they employed? Are they unemployed? Like understanding their story and then telling a series of stories each time you're trying to communicate to them that causes them to engage in your story and maybe see themselves in your story. If you misread the audience, it'll go right over their head and they won't engage. Mistake number 5 is lack of narrative intelligence. That's what we've been talking about here, is not knowing either how to tell a story, what story is appropriate, how to connect your story with the story of the audience. And mistake number 6 is not telling the truth. There's something about authenticity, and I'm just going to say it because I think too much happens in Christianity, among Christian leaders even. We hear so much hyperbole. We even have our own word for it. We call it evangelistically speaking. That's stinking ridiculous that we would have a way of talking about how we Christian leaders stretch the truth so often. I remember Dr. Jack Hayford told me, he was on our board for 10 years, and that he learned really young that a newspaper had called him about, had called several churches about, what's happening in your church. They want to do an article, and they asked how many people come on Sundays, and he said, he gave them a number, whatever it was, 8,263, and they came back to him and said, you are the only pastor that gave us an exact number. Everybody else said, oh, over this number or under this number or almost this number, and even little phrases like that reek of lack of credibility, lack of truth telling. And so as much as possible, whenever we communicate, I never like to say we had almost this many. Just put how many we had, and just let's be as exact as we can as we're talking about. Sometimes my problem is this: I'll get so excited about a vision, I'll say we can do this, we can do this, we can do this, and it sounds almost too good to be true, and like I may not be telling the truth. So we just got to be careful about, we could do this. Like we have potential to do this, and we think we have the possibility of doing this because we got the framework, we got the building blocks. We know it can be done. It has been done, and so communicate with authenticity. But even if we don't make it, if we only get halfway there, it's still, aren't you glad that we put forth the effort? And so even by doing that brings credibility by saying even if we don't, at least we've reached a lot more than we would have reached. So attention misdirected. Sometimes this happens where even in the middle of a talk, something accidentally will happen, or somebody will get off on a rabbit trail, tell a story that doesn't apply, and you've just taken, if you think about every time you have a chance to influence people, small group, big group, it doesn't matter. You're taking their mind and their heart somewhere on a journey. And anything you do, you can justify it as a rabbit trail. How did I get off onto that? And this kind of thing. You've just taken them away from this. You only have so much time with them. Only have so much time to influence them. So don't misdirect their attention. And then finally, inability to elicit desire for change. We talked about that in the last lesson. This is the most important thing. You can go through all the data and all the videos and all the cool things, but if you can't elicit inside them where they go, oh my gosh, I want to be a part of that change, well, then you got a problem. Some questions we should ask: how exactly do leaders communicate complex ideas and spark others to enduringly enthusiastic action? I would say, and he would say, by stories. Stories of change. We'll talk about the kinds of stories. What words do they use to inspire others to become new leaders? Why are some leaders able to accomplish the feat while others fail miserably? And so the language of change in leadership talks a lot about how to tell these stories. And remember, we talked about this before. If you just give reasons, it's not a good and effective way. You've got to inspire them. Remember that the whole thing called confirmation bias in change management, it's something you've got to be always aware of, that just giving the reasons, giving the logic, it won't work. And I could tell you so many stories about this, not just in personal experience, but all these books we've been talking about that give all the logic in the world, people will not change, right? Remember, getting their attention, stimulate desire for change, and then reinforce with reasons. That could be data, but if you could pack the data in stories, reinforcing with reasons works better. Effective way to get their attention: stories about the audience problem. Remember, read the audience well. Stories about a likely trajectory of the audience's problems, where they could end up. They might be getting worse. A surprising question or challenge in an area of interest to the audience. So you're getting their attention. You're not just going, welcome back to church, here's another thing. You're getting their attention. Very important. People are attracted to things. Attention is attracted to things that are unexpected. by engaging emotions, by what's personal to listeners and to themselves, like a real personal struggles they're having. You're telling stories, not their stories, but stories that might address their personal struggles. It's important that whatever's used to get the attention is relevant to the subject at hand. So don't just be talking about going to Mars. Oh, by the way, we're going to reach young people. And finally, it's engaged by what's negative. Now, be careful on this. I mean, use it wisely. A lot of news services, that's their whole business model. Enough negativity to keep people's eyeballs there so that they can sell an ad. However, when you talk about how many kids are on drugs in your town, how many unwanted pregnancies, how many divorces, that means something. Like, this is real. It's not just national data. It's right here in our town. And so, but even then, using the stories that are personal about that data is most important. To recap some of these methods, or tell a story about the audience's story, about how you handled diversity. Ask a question about something, because when you ask a question, Jesus did this a lot. You engage them, going, well, how would I answer that question? Use a striking metaphor. You may have heard me talk about this rising wave of change. What were you caught in that wave? If you were caught in a wave, what when you're swimming away? Welcome to our future. It's a wave of change. Launching unexpected exercise, issuing a challenge, sharing something of value that really moved you. So getting their attention, and not just reciting facts. You got to start with that. Then you stimulate the desire. How do you do that? Well, you got to gain enthusiastic buy-in, painting a vision for the future. We talked about imagine this, imagine that. And so there are ways to do that with stories, stories of people or churches that started this, some of the case studies that I mentioned. These guys have done this all around the world, and now we're learning these best practices. And you're getting them a sense of like, wow, we could be one of those on the cutting edge when everything's changing. We're not out there just trying to reinvent the wheel. We're actually learning from other people that are doing it. And so talk about what change can look like, how it'll work, how we're going to get from here to there, why it'll work. And so you're eliciting a desire for change by showing stories where people have done it. And then finally, reinforce with reasons. And reasons come after you've given the emotional connection from the first two, right? You give them, did you know this much data and this much data and this much data about youth in our own town, right? So cultivating in narrative intelligence is starting to think narratively about what's the story your congregation is telling themselves about their faith, about their family, about your church. And then you tell a story that kind of intersects with that and shapes that story. Okay, you're speaking narratively, intelligently. Okay, so again, as you're reinforcing with reasons, I would encourage you always make sure that any reasons you give that is data is packed in or baked into another story, even if it's a mini story. Narrative intelligence has to do with the capacity to understand the world in narrative terms. There's all kinds of narratives. There's a Fox News narrative, there's a CNN narrative, there's all kinds of narratives. There's the devil's narrative, there's God's narrative, there's Jesus' narrative, there's the narrative you hear at work. And so understanding in terms of narratives, to be familiar with the different components and different dimensions of narratives, and to know what different patterns of stories exist and which of the narrative patterns are most likely to have the right effect in this situation. So, Malcolm Gladwell, I'm sure you've heard him. He quotes him in his book. We all want to believe that our data, our idea is going to keep their attention, but it's how we deliver it is just as important. And he says, the reality is that how we present our ideas is going to be a huge part of the determining whether ideas are accepted or ignored. Style can't be separated from substance. And so, telling stories is going to be a huge thing. Just want to encourage you again to get your audience, to invite them to daydream, to imagine a different future. And this is what the world is going to look like if we all do this together. And to remind them of different dimensions of that as you reconvene that audience, whether it's the whole congregation or this subgroup or that subgroup or that subgroup. You might find yourself repeating yourself, but that's okay. You're getting different groups to imagine different things, right? So for discussion here, eliciting desire for change is arguably the most important part of change management. What can you do as a team member to elicit this in all the sectors of our church? And then number two, how can we use narrative intelligence as we communicate the vision for Project 13 and building an exponential church? So discuss these questions and then come back to the next module.